Invictus Fleet Week is finally here, and with it comes the forever-awaited first look at the RSI Polaris. Available on the very first day to look at on the show floor, the Polaris dominates the main hall as it utterly dwarfs the constellations around it. As we are extremely likely to see this ship released within the next 6 months, or by IAE, I think this is a great time to go over everything we know about the Polaris, including misconceptions about its hangar, the risks of a torpedo-based ship, and how I anticipate it will impact the PU when it arrives later this year. I've also left timestamps down below, so feel free to jump around to sections that interest you the most. If by the end, I helped make some sense of this incredible weapons platform, a like and subscribe is always appreciated. Let's start with a tour. The bridge of the Polaris comes with 5 total seats, 2 at the very front, a captain's chair in the middle, and then 2 in the rear. I believe one of these seats will be the pilot, 2 will be dedicated to weapons, and 2 more to engineering and power management to give the ship the agility it needs as priorities shift on the battlefield. Moving back, we have a door that leads us to a room full of escape pods. As death gets more and more punishing in the verse, especially with the addition of Death of a Spaceman, these are going to be crucial to those on board. Its placement here gives the bridge crew, as well as the crew quarters, easy access to escape during an emergency, so long as there's only about 8 people around. Speaking of crew quarters, directly behind the escape room, we have the captain's room, second-in-command's room, and the bunk room for the rest of the crew. We also have the kitchens and the armory. While the fate of bedlogging in the verse is still uncertain, having access to a kitchen will undoubtedly be valuable on the long journeys expected out of ships of this size. After all, there is a limit to the number of cruise lux that you can fit into your pockets. As of late, we're seeing an increasing number of ships gain access to an armory. To me, this further reinforces the idea that the clothes and armor we wear will play an important role in the gameplay we can access. For example, the Cutter Rambler gets access to a suit locker, presumably to carry a spare suit used for exploration, such as a Novikov for cold weather. We also know that we won't always be able to man pilot seats with heavy armor on, so being able to quickly swap to and from military gear will be a welcome addition for all of this ship's operations. Past the living quarters brings us to one of the strongest features of the Polaris, its hangar. I'll have an entire section dedicated to the hangar later in the video, but for now, we know that this hangar has a small cargo elevator to the lower decks and exits in all 4 directions. On the right, we have the medical bay. This is going to be invaluable for operations. If CIG intends on making the recent changes to medical beds permanent, the Polaris will be able to deploy its fighter with much more confidence that even if its pilot gets blown up, they will be returned to the Polaris for respawn, allowing it to avoid having to conduct a rescue in a combat situation. It also gives the Polaris the ability to deploy smaller complements of troops to the ground, knowing that they can be recovered with relative ease if the worst is to happen. On the other side of the hangar, we have the jail cells. While I don't think every bounty hunter needs to end up with the Polaris, it is undoubtedly true that some targets will find their way onto massive capital and subcapital ships in installments. That is when having a Polaris handy will be most useful for bounty hunters, since you'll be able to recover the target and store them directly on board. Finally, at the rear, you have access to a turret, as well as the lower decks, which have cargo and engineering. Speaking of which, at the rear, we have access to our components, so engineers will likely be spending a lot of their time here, away from the rest of the crew. Moving forward, we have the cargo deck, which can hold up to 216 SCU. While this isn't a lot of space, we should easily be able to fit vehicles and snubs smaller than the Ursa rover, including the new medical Ursa. I can definitely see the Polaris able to store some short ships in the cargo bay, like a Razor or maybe even a C8. The size of ship will likely be restricted by the ramp entrances on either side of the ship. Finally, back at the very front of the ship, we have the torpedo bay. This bay has stations that will be needed to reload the 4 torpedo tubes. As we've seen, capital ships are huge, but are actually defined by their components, not necessarily their size. The Polaris comes with a size 4 capital shield generator, temporarily reported in the PU as having 775,000 HP. This is an absolutely enormous amount of shielding. If you want some context to ground that number, an 890 jump has 2 of those shields for roughly 1.5 million HP today. Compare that to something like an A2 with 2 size 3 shields, and that comes in at a measly 200,000 total shield HP. While these numbers may change going forward, the intention and relative HP between the sizes gives us an understanding of just how tanky these shields are going to be. All of this even ignores the armoring that's likely to come on military ships like the Polaris as well. While we know very little about armor today, I think it's quite likely that small arms fire will do next to nothing to ships like the Polaris. We also get a capital power plant and a capital cooler to keep a ship of this size well powered and running smooth. The Polaris is also one of the few ships that gets access to a capital radar. I think this is a severely underrated aspect of the Polaris. It's going to be a massive advantage in scanning systems for threats. You may not think of a Polaris as stealthy the way you would think of an Eclipse as being stealthy, but finding the enemy on your radar before they find you will still give your attack some amount of surprise factor. Unlike the 890 jump, we do only get a large quantum drive instead of a capital one. While on the surface this seems like a negative, smaller quantum drives are actually more efficient than larger ones, at times at the cost of speed. Seeing as the Polaris is a military ship, however, it's likely to come with a military-grade quantum drive, and so its total amount of quantum fuel will be a strong determining factor in the role the ship will play in the verse. We do note that the Polaris has 2 medium computers on board, but until we see the scope and responsibilities of these computers, I would hold off on making any judgments based on that fact alone. As a military ship, the Polaris comes heavily armed with several turrets. At the front, we have a manned turret with twin size 5 weapons. Moving back, up top, we have 2 more manned turrets, each with 2 size 4s, so roughly half the DPS of a hammerhead turret. On either side, about halfway down, are hidden turrets, each one having 4 size 3s. Finally, in the back, we have 1 remote missile turret on top holding 12 size 2 weapons, and 1 remote turret on the bottom having 4 size 3 weapons as well. This gives us 7 turrets in total, with decent coverage of the sides and top of the Polaris, but a glaring weakness on its soft underbelly. While you may think that this is more than you need, keep in mind that the Polaris is an absolutely massive ship. So even with 7 turrets, it will have a blind spot, and weakness to smaller fighters that will be able to stay in those blind spots with greater ease than you might expect. In fact, I think these weapons are actually quite small for a ship of this size, but it's important to keep in mind that you also have the option to bring a fighter like a Scorpius with you if that's something that you prioritize. That said, the role of the Polaris isn't to hang around and act as a gunship, but rather to bring a swift, clean precision strike that will cripple large enemy ships and infrastructure. I'm talking, of course, of the size 10 torpedoes. The Polaris comes equipped with an insane 28 size 10 torpedoes. We all know how deadly a size 9 torpedo can be, currently capable of destroying even large ships with a single hit. We don't currently have any direct numbers or intentions on how much damage a size 10 torpedo will do, but to get a rough prediction, I created a chart that plots size against damage. Extrapolating the graph to size 10 gives us a damage number of roughly 750,000. Thinking back to capital shields, those have roughly the same amount of shield HP as one size 10 missile does damage. From that, I think it is safe to say that anything with less than a capital shield is going to get blown up in one shot no matter what. Larger ships like an 890 may take up to 3 or 4 shots, but if the torpedoes strike the same shield face, it would take fewer. Before you get too worried about this, keep in mind that these massive torpedoes will likely move very slowly and have terrible maneuverability. I see these torpedoes as only really being useful for hitting capital or corvette targets at the smallest, but preferably just large static infrastructure like bases. They will also be really, really expensive to rearm. For smaller targets, the Polaris will also come with 32 size 3 missiles. The other party trick of the Polaris is its hangar. While I was originally tempted to go over to the wonderful StarJump Fleet Viewer and experiment with what fits inside the doors of the Polaris, we can actually see in the videos of the hangar given to us by CIG that the walls slant outwards. This means that the size of the actual pad will be smaller than the door. What we can say for sure is that it is supposed to be an XS sized hangar, which means any ship that has a size of less than 24 by 32 by 12 meters should fit. Theoretically, larger ships that fit within the walls but have a ground footprint that fits the XS dimensions should also fit, but I wouldn't be purchasing a Polaris hoping that a Cutlass Black will fit inside. For ships that do fit inside though, having refuel, rearm, and repair capability is going to be absolutely priceless. So what is the role of the Polaris? CIG themselves describe the Polaris as the tip of the spear, and I think that's exactly right. Given its lack of high sustained DPS, I think you really want to use the Polaris as a strike vessel, a ship that uses its superior scanning to formulate an attack strategy, and let off a few volleys of size 10 missiles to soften or destroy large targets and infrastructure. This is of course before bruisers like an Idris or Perseus come in to continue that fight. A Polaris may also be deployed for search and rescue operations. With a medbay and a hangar to deploy a shuttle, this ship can give you the peace of mind to know that you should be able to tackle all but the largest threats in your efforts to recover valuable targets. It should also be able to tackle raid boss style missions, especially when accompanied by anti-fighter platforms like the Hammerhead. Being able to carry a Legionnaire opens up the possibility of raiding large convoys that wouldn't dare return fire unless they want to eat a size 10 missile. So don't think you won't see pirates in their own Polaris as well, maybe even with a Mantis in the hangar to prevent you from running. It isn't all sunshine and rainbows though. There are two major risks of owning a Polaris in my opinion. First, CIG has been clear that the cost of running ships of this size are going to be huge. Whether that be for upkeep of those capital components, fuel, or those incredibly expensive torpedoes that may end up costing millions of aUEC just by themselves. Regardless, owning this ship is going to lose you money, that much is clear. The other risk is crew size. I think at the very least you're going to need 7 people to keep a Polaris alive. A pilot, 3 turret gunners, a torpedo bay engineer, and 2 other engineers for repairs during combat. Keep in mind this still wouldn't saturate all the seats of the Polaris, and ignores the crew of whatever ship you have in the hangar, which could be 2 more right there. You may be able to hire NPCs or buy AI blades for some of these roles, but until we have a much better understanding of how those things are going to work, I wouldn't rely on them to make a purchasing decision today. Both of these risks make me worry that this ship is going to end up collecting dust in the hangar of many a citizen. You may only ever get to take this ship out on weekends, or if you're part of a large org. Even then, the content that this ship is made for may not always be available to you. I'm not one to tell other people how they should be spending their money, but this is an incredibly expensive ship, and I just want to make sure that you're as informed as possible if you do decide to make that purchase. Keep in mind, this game is still in development, and a lot can change over time. This is actually my one big ship. I did a lot of CCU training to get mine for way less than MSRP, and I can make a video about that if there's enough interest, but in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video. I've been away for a long time now due to some personal issues, but I'm back now and I'm excited to bring you the best content that I can. To that end, if you learned something, a like and subscribe is always appreciated. Let me know how you feel about the Polaris and whether or not you'll be picking one up. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.